Hello, fifth graders. This is Mrs. Gariepi, and I'm here today with our guest speaker who wasn't able to come to our classrooms, but she is here with me, and we're going to do the interview for you all to watch. So here I am with Mrs. Lizette Fernandez, and Mrs. Fernandez is a survivor of the Cuban Revolution. So she has an interesting story to tell about how her life was before, during, what happened, and after. So can't wait for you all to hear her story. Miss Fernandez, could you tell our fifth graders about what life was like for you when you were a child before Fidel Castro came into power? What do you remember?
Well, I remember that things were very, very beautiful in my world because my grandfather was vice president of Cuba in the 40s. And he was retired, but nevertheless, we lived very well. And it wasn't exuberant, but it was, it was a nice life. And I had a beautiful house. My parents had maids, had servants. My mother had a chauffeur driven limousine for herself. And things were very comfortable and very nice. There wasn't a lot of spending, in unnecessary money, but we did live nicely. My father had 2 yachts. My father had a plane, his Cessna. And my grandfather had a beautiful sailboat. And my grandmother was the director of Pro Arts in Cuba. She was soprano. And I remember my grandfather sneaking me into the opera to watch my grandmother sing. And those were beautiful memories for me. I was only 5, so I don't remember a whole lot, but what I do remember, it all was beautiful. And my aunts, they all had nice homes. We were 17 cousins, so I had a lot of cousins to play with. And one day our world just came crumbling down. And but before that, everything was nice. Everything was beautiful. I don't remember any pain, any heartaches. I don't remember any of that because I didn't see it. And my grandparents lived very comfortably. They had old money, not new money. It was old money. And they knew how to take care of their money. They didn't throw it away.
Ms. Fernandez, would you say that your lifestyle when you were a child, with the comfortable living, was common with most of the people of Cuba, or was there a difference?
Yes, there was a drastic difference. Just like there's a difference in this country among those that are wealthy and those that are not wealthy. The difference is my grandparents were wealthy, but they didn't misuse their money, which was very important to my grandfather. My grandfather was known as a man who was very, very humble. And therefore, we led a comfortable life, but there wasn't a lot of throwing away. And
So as we're sitting here talking with Ms. Fernandez, she talked about how her life dramatically changed one night because of the Cuban Revolution. For those of us that are not so familiar with the Cuban Revolution, Fidel Castro was the leader of the revolution who was fighting against the Cuban government and was not doing it in such a nice way, and eventually he took over. Now, Miss Fernandez's life was significantly affected by this change that happened. Miss Fernandez, can you please tell us in what ways did life change for you? What happened?
Well, it was practically from one minute to the next that my life and my brother's life drastically changed. We were kept from all the conversations, and we were kept from anything that would upset us in any way. And my parents came first from Cuba. My father was snuggled in the nose of a plane, and my mother had to come with him, and we were left with my grandparents. And my grandparents for months kept us away from hearing anything or being involved in anything. And one day she made my little bag and his, and she said to us, "You have to go. You have to go be with your mama and your papa." And she was crying, and I didn't understand where my mama and my papa had gone to. All I knew was that I was with my grandparents that I loved so very much. So I didn't know who was coming back or what was happening. I was only 5 years old, going on 6, and my brother was younger than I was. And one day we walked outside. My grandmother was crying, and she said to me, "You have to go." And I didn't want to go.
Did you know where you were going?
No, I didn't know where. All I knew was that I was going to be reunited with my mother and father. And
So you had no idea that you were even leaving the country.
right, and not only that, but I was brought to outside to the sidewalk, and a man that I had never seen before drove up to our house in a chauffeur driven limousine. And my grandmother said, "You've got to go in. You've got to get in, and it's going to be all right." And she was crying, so I couldn't understand how was everything going to be all right when she was in complete tears. And so we left with this stranger, and we came to the airport, and we got on a plane, and we were brought here. And this is when airports were open. They weren't like airports now that are closed in. And I could hear I got out of the plane, and I could hear somebody calling my name among everybody that was waving to their family, like you see on TV when they get on a ship or something. And I heard my mother's voice, and I knew that I was being reunited with her. I didn't know where I was. All I knew is that I was with my mother and my father.
So we're back here with Miss Fernandez, and just as a quick recap, Miss Fernandez told us that as a child, before she was the age of 6, she was born and living in Cuba with her family, who was of old Cuban money. And then suddenly, instantly, her father and her mother had to leave. She stayed with her grandparents, And then after a few months, she left with a total stranger to help her and her brother get on a plane to come here to the United States. So a question that I have, Ms. Fernandez, is why did your father have to leave Cuba so what seems to me to be so quickly and quietly?
Because since my father was with Fidel, and then he realized what was going on, that Fidel wasn't doing what he promised he would do, my father rebelled against him with a group of men, and Fidel was looking for him all through the island to put him in jail. And so that's why my father left and came here. And when we were reunited with my parents here, I remember the first night that I was looking for my dolls, I was looking for my clothes. I thought maybe at the end of the week we could go back on the yacht or go on the plane. I used to love getting on the plane. And
What happened to all those possessions in Cuba?
well, Castro kept them all for himself. Castro kept everything. He was in charge of the island. He took over. Nobody has any say when somebody takes over in that way.
So your grandparents remained
Yes.
in Cuba.
Yes.
Have you ever seen them again?
No, I never saw them again. My grandmother, who I adored, passed away when I was about 15 years old, and my grandfather passed away when he was in his 90s. I was married, and that's when he passed away. But they never came. And
And Miss
it was only
Fernandez,
through letters that I would.
and you had told me as well that your grandfather made a little deal with Fidel Castro.
Yes.
Could you explain that to the children?
Well, my grandfather was, besides being vice president, he was had been a professor. He had been Fidel's professor. Fidel was his student. Fidel was studying law because Fidel was a lawyer. And my grandfather went to him and said, look, I have a respect for you as far as your profession, your lawyer's profession, and I have fond memories of you. You have fond memories of me. I want to be here for you if you have anything, not that has anything to do with the revolution, but anything in the aspect of law. As far as law is concerned, I'm willing to help you. I respect you. I want for you to respect me. My grandfather was very well known and very diplomatic. And so Fidel said that was fine. And as a matter of fact, after my grandfather passed away, he named a street after my grandfather,
Isn't that interesting?
which was quite interesting. And I remember our lives when we were here. We didn't know where we were. We didn't know what was the United States. We were only children, small children. And at night, I would look for my dolls. I would look for everything that I owned, and all of that was gone.
So
All
with
of
the
that.
revolution,
Yes.
you lost everything of your possessions.
Yes, as a
And-
matter of fact, my mother, all my mother brought were our pictures, an album. That's all that was left.
So, Ms. Fernandez, I'm hearing that once you arrived here in the U.S., it wasn't the same as it was in Cuba. Can
No.
you please explain to the students what was your life like once you arrived here?
Well, we lived in Miami, and the reason why we lived in Miami is because Miami is very close to Cuba. It's practically the closest place in the United States that one can live closest to Cuba. So that's where most of the Cubans eventually went, to Miami. And our life changed drastically from the big house that we had. My mother and my father had a small apartment, and that was shocking for me because I didn't understand why we were living in a little place. And I asked for my dolls, I asked for my things, and my parents simply said, maybe later, maybe later, maybe later, we'll give them to you. And that later never came. As a matter of fact, my parents were always in the goodwill. That's the goodwill is the only thing there was for secondhand things. It's not like now that you've got the Salvation Army and you have thrift stores. Back in the 60s, it was just the goodwill. And my parents, everything we owned came from the goodwill. My clothes, my toys. I had new toys. They were old toys. And my parents bought old stuff, old furniture, and they would paint them and fix them. And that's all I ever saw growing up. We had a very nice home, but it was all secondhand things that had been fixed and put together. And the doll had one eye sewn back on and this sort of thing. And that was hard. That was hard. And but we learned to appreciate what we had because when you have things and you lose them like that, you learn to appreciate things. My father had a job in a 7-Eleven.
Miss Fernandez, what was your father's job in Cuba before he became involved with Fidel?
My father was a pilot.
Pilot, that's right, because he
Yes.
had a plane.
Yes.
Okay, so then you come here,
Yes.
and he's not flying planes anymore.
Right. He's not flying planes anymore, and he's working in a 7-Eleven. And I remember him saying that the hardest day in his life was one day when he took a bag of groceries out to a lady, and she tipped him a quarter. And back in the 60s, being tipped a quarter was good money. But nevertheless, my father was heartbroken because my father was the one who always tipped. Nobody had ever tipped my father working as a clerk. It was very hard. And my mother had it hard too. My mother had to go work in a factory, and things changed drastically. But we learned to appreciate what we had because we had been on both sides of the fence. We had things. We didn't splurge and throw away money, but we lived very comfortably. And then we were tossed, as if to say, another type of life altogether different. And so we learned to appreciate things. And I think that was an enormous lesson for us in life. It was a bad thing we went through, but at the same time, we learned to appreciate what we had. And it's very important when one is young to not gripe about what they want and what they want to have, because there's people out there that have very little and they're grateful for what they have.
Ms. Fernandez, this has been a wonderful talk. I have my last question for you. Why do you think it's important for the 5th grade students of today to hear your story?
Because one day my world turned upside down and I wasn't expecting it to, but it did. And we never know what tomorrow holds. And we have to learn to appreciate what we have, because it can all crumble one day overnight. You can lose your parents, you can lose everything. Everything you have. Imagine each one of you, imagine how you live, and just to put yourself in somebody's shoes like mine, where overnight you lose everything. That really does something to a human being, and it makes you appreciate what you have. It makes you appreciate your parents, and it makes you appreciate what little or much they can give you.
So 5th graders, next year you move on to middle school, and that's a big change in your life. Ms. Fernandez, do you have any advice for our 5th grade friends who are about to embark on a new part of their life journey?
Well, my advice would be to appreciate what they have, concentrate on getting ahead, because you just don't know what can happen. You can lose your job, your life can just turn upside down. So you must be ready and concentrate on studying and getting ahead versus being on the phone, being on the television, because those things are not going to get you ahead. And the more you are prepared, the better your existence should anything happen, God forbid, in our country. Because we never thought there would be a revolution in my country, and it happened. And so this can happen to any country. But the better you are prepared and the more schooling you have, the better are your chances of getting ahead later on. So,
Thank you so much, Ms. Fernandez,
You're
for
welcome.
allowing me to interview you for our 5th grade students. And I really appreciate the time that you spent. Thank you so much.
You're very welcome.